A black man stands alone outside the iron gates of a military funeral. Silent, still, holding a small bouquet of wilted white lilies. "This is a restricted area, sir. Military funeral, 4-star general, no clearance, no entry." The white cop barely looks at him. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just stood there, holding a small bouquet of white lilies that had clearly wilted in the cold morning. Inside the iron gates, things gleamed: medals, flags, and camera flashes. No one, except the 4-star general standing at the podium, and nobody except the one person whose decision would stop everything. If you believe no veteran should be left behind, hit like and subscribe. The morning air over Fort Hamilton was muted gray. Early autumn had painted the trees along the road in fading golds and rusty red. American flags stirred gently in the breeze, posted every 20 feet up the gravel walkway toward the cemetery gate. On the other side, hundreds had already gathered: soldiers, politicians, top brass, faces stiff with solemnity. This wasn't just another service. It was the burial of General Jonathan A. Carter, a 4-star general whose career shaped generations of special operations. He was the kind of name that made headlines. And today was for him. Security was tight, protocol tighter. Guests were verified, badges checked. Nobody entered without clearance. Not even retired veterans, not even someone like Samuel Lewis. He had come alone, quiet, from across the state. A long bus ride, no escort, no fanfare. His uniform, pressed with care, had faded from deep green to a dull gray blue. No medals. Just a single stitched unit patch on his shoulder and that bouquet in his hands. Samuel had barely reached the entrance before the cop, dressed in full dress blues, stepped forward. "Sorry, sir, private service. Do you have clearance?" Samuel's eyes, cloudy but calm, held. "No," he replied. "I'm only here to pay respects." The cop didn't hesitate. "Then I'm afraid you'll have to move back." Samuel didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just nodded and stepped aside. And there he waited. One step past the gate. But inside that fence, a man had already seen him. A man who would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Samuel Lewis arrived at the edge of Fort Hamilton National Cemetery. He stood still. His cane rested against the wrought iron gate. His eyes scanned the flags, the tall white tent, the polished black cars parked beside the procession. He didn't expect to be welcomed. He came without invitation. Inside the cemetery, things were beginning. Rows of uniforms, white gloves, gold trim, and shined shoes filed into place. The bugler checked his instrument. Honor guards lined up along the aisle. They were preparing to lay to rest General Jonathan A. Carter, a man decorated in nearly every campaign since Desert Storm. The crowd included senators, foreign dignitaries, and nearly every military branch commander. The cop at the gate kept glancing at Samuel, but said nothing more. Just enough distance to keep him outside. Samuel didn't seem to mind. He wasn't there for the crowd. He stood motionless, a wilted lily trembling in his palm, the edges browned by wind and time. His uniform wasn't regulation anymore, but it was spotless, his boots polished. The patch on his shoulder, one that most wouldn't recognize, read Reaper Company, 7th Recon, a unit long buried under black ink and silence. It hadn't officially existed in 40 years, but someone inside the gates did recognize it. Colonel Travis Monroe, Carter's former aide, squinted from a few yards away. He was helping coordinate press lines when he glanced toward the gate and froze. That patch, that face. It couldn't be, but it was. "Sir," he whispered, leaning toward General Price, who stood near the casket with hands folded behind his back. Price turned. "Who?" "Samuel Lewis," Monroe replied. "It's him." General Andrew Price stiffened. His eyes darted past the crowd, past the podium, past the press, and locked onto the still figure at the cemetery gate. His expression changed instantly. He didn't wait. He didn't ask for a vehicle. He simply removed his gloves, handed off his ceremonial saber, and walked directly toward the gate. Honor guards parted in confusion. The crowd hushed. A single reporter raised a camera, then froze. Because in that moment, everyone realized the 4-star general wasn't walking to a casket. He was walking to a forgotten black soldier holding a flower. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. 1 second, General Andrew Price was standing in perfect formation beside the casket. The next, he was striding down the aisle, flanked by no one, not even his security detail. A sea of polished boots, crisp creases, and flashing medals shifted awkwardly as the general walked directly toward the cemetery gates. He didn't speak. He didn't look left or right. He walked like a man on a mission, and everyone watched. Samuel Lewis, still gripping the wilted lily, finally noticed the movement. He blinked once, unsure. Then again. The general was coming straight toward him. When Price reached the gate, he stopped. For one long moment, the two men just stood there, the decorated 4-star general in full dress uniform and the old black veteran in his faded coat. Then, without a word, General Price saluted. It was sharp, clean. The kind of salute you give to someone whose rank doesn't matter, but whose actions shaped everything. "Sir," the general said, voice low and full, "we've been waiting for you." Samuel blinked slowly, eyes glistening. "You don't have to," he started. But Price raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "With all due respect, Mr. Lewis," he said. "Yes, I do." He turned slightly and gestured to Colonel Monroe, who stepped forward from the funeral tent carrying a small, polished wooden box, engraved, wrapped in ceremonial silk. In front of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, and every branch in uniform, General Price handed the box to Samuel Lewis himself. "The ashes of General Jonathan A. Carter," he said. "He wanted you to bring him home. You were the last man he trusted." Samuel's hands trembled. His eyes didn't move from the box. "I thought they forgot," he whispered. General Price's voice cracked. "We didn't." Behind them, from the far edge of the tent, more movement. A small cluster of elderly men, late 70s, some with canes, others with rigid backs, began to rise. Each one wore a faded patch. Reaper Company. As Samuel stepped forward, carrying the urn, they saluted, one by one. Not out of protocol, but out of memory, out of debt. The wind shifted just slightly as Samuel Lewis stepped past the cemetery gate, holding the polished wooden urn close to his chest. The grass beneath his worn boots felt soft, sacred. The faces in the crowd blurred together, some shocked, others still standing in stunned silence. But those who truly understood had already risen. Reaper Company, now mostly gray-haired and bent by time, stood at full attention. Their uniforms didn't match. Their boots weren't polished. But their eyes said everything. They remembered. And now they were honoring the man who had once led them through fire. General Price walked beside him, step for step. No words, just presence. No one interrupted, not even the press. For a moment, the flash of cameras slowed. Even the reporters seemed to realize something larger was unfolding, something you don't capture in pixels. Samuel reached the base of the flag-draped platform and paused. His breath was calm, but his heart pounded with memories. Because this wasn't just about a funeral, it was about something that had happened 57 years ago, a night so few even remembered. Laos, 1967. Operation Cold Shadow. It wasn't even an official war zone, but they were there, Reaper Company, deep in jungle thickets, defending a supply route nobody was supposed to know about. Samuel had been a sergeant, 2 tours in, older than most, younger than his own fear. That night, the bunker had collapsed under mortar fire. Smoke, chaos, screaming over radios. "We're hit! We're outside the wire!" someone had shouted. He didn't ask for backup. He didn't wait. He just moved. He remembered sprinting through brush, a pistol in one hand and flares strapped to his vest. He found the two men behind a half-destroyed barrel hut, one bleeding badly, the other still shielding him, terrified but alive. One of them was Lieutenant Carter, the same Carter whose ashes now trembled in Samuel's grip. "You boys lose your map?" Samuel had muttered back then, pulling them up by their jackets. He got them out, through smoke, through fire. Took a gash across his back, declined the medal, declined the citation. Never told a soul. Now, here he stood, not in jungle, but on a field of ceremony. And behind him, more officers began to stand, because they were beginning to understand who Samuel Lewis was. Back at Fort Hamilton, the ceremony had paused. But it wasn't because of a schedule change, it was because of a man, a black man, standing in a uniform too old for regulation, holding the ashes of a 4-star general. And nobody questioned it now. The press didn't shout, the cameras didn't flash, not even the aides dared to interrupt, because something bigger than protocol was unfolding. Samuel Lewis stood still beside the pedestal, the urn in his hands. A breeze rustled the flags and whispered through the canopy of trees above. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His eyes remained on the wooden box, heavy, not just with ash, but with history. Then, gently, General Price stepped up beside him. He spoke just loud enough to be heard, but soft enough to keep the moment sacred. 57 years, he said, eyes never leaving the urn. He never forgot what you did. Samuel didn't look at him. He talked about it, he asked quietly. Only once, Price replied. And then, every day in silence. They stood together for a beat longer. Then Samuel lowered the urn carefully onto the stand just above the folded flag. It wasn't protocol, but it was right. From the edge of the platform, an officer stepped forward, a captain in his 40s, bronze star on his chest. He leaned to whisper into General Price's ear, then quickly pulled back. "They're asking if we're ready to proceed," he said. Price turned to him. "No," he answered simply. "Not yet." He stepped to the microphone, intended for a formal eulogy. But he didn't read the prepared script. He didn't even open the folder. Instead, he looked out over the assembly, voice firm but full of something deeper. "There are heroes we decorate," he began, "and there are heroes we forget, until moments like this." He turned, hand extended toward Samuel. "If not for this man," Price continued, "General Carter wouldn't have lived past 19, and neither would I." A hush fell so complete, it felt like time had frozen. Then, one by one, people began to rise, not out of command, but out of respect. Dozens of officers, family, even reporters, standing not for a rank, but for a debt remembered. But one man hadn't stood yet, and when he finally did, the entire crowd turned. At the far edge of the ceremony, where the official ranks ended and the silent watchers stood, an elderly black veteran rose. He wore a jacket too thin for the season, a hat with faded stitching, and eyes heavy with memory. A cane balanced in his hand. He stood slowly, his joints stiff with age, but his posture straight with pride. Others noticed. Then the man beside him rose. Then another. Within moments, the entire cemetery field stood, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood. Even the press lowered their cameras, because what was happening wasn't for show. It was real. General Price stepped down from the platform and turned to Samuel. His voice was quieter now, closer to a friend's than a leader's. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the rows of soldiers, officers, and civilians now forming a pathway down the center of the field. And beyond that, the final resting place of the man he once saved. At last, Samuel nodded. Together, shoulder to shoulder, the general and the forgotten veteran began to walk. The urn in Samuel's hands caught the sunlight briefly, the silk wrap gleaming as they passed the first row of chairs. One by one, soldiers along the aisle lifted their hands in salute, some crisp, some trembling, but all of them stood tall. The honor guard parted without a word, aisle cleared. Franklin walked not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as the honored bearer of his brother's remains. Each step down that aisle was a step back in time, not into war, but into memory. The wind stilled, flags ceased fluttering. No drums, no anthem, just footsteps. And then, Samuel Lewis reached the platform. He placed the urn above the folded flag, just where it belonged. Not because of protocol, but because of principle. He stood back. The silence held. Even General Price said nothing. Because the moment was whole. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because behind them, a young officer approached, envelope in hand, with a message that would finally unlock the past. The young lieutenant approached slowly, the white envelope in his hand trembling slightly. His eyes darted from General Price to Samuel Lewis, unsure of how to interrupt such a sacred silence. But he was expected. General Price nodded once. "Go ahead." The lieutenant stepped forward and extended the envelope carefully to Samuel. "Sir, this was found in General Carter's personal safe. He left instructions. It's for you, only if you came all the way." Samuel's eyes fixed on the envelope. It was small, handwritten, yellowed at the edges. He took it carefully, the paper soft under his calloused fingers. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single paragraph. No introduction, no formality. Just a message written with weight. "Frank, you never let me thank you. Not properly. You saved my life and vanished like it didn't matter. But it mattered to me. You were the debt I carried more than any rank or medal. You let me serve. You let me lead. You let me live long enough to die in peace. And if there's justice, one day they'll speak my name beside yours. Only then will I feel worthy." Jonathan. Samuel didn't blink. He folded the letter carefully and placed it into his inner coat pocket, right beside the heart he'd guarded for decades. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I know," Price replied, just as soft. "That's why you deserve it." Time seemed to pause again. No music, no clapping. Just the kind of reverence only men like Samuel earn. Not in ceremony, but in silence. 1 year later. A bronze plaque was unveiled under a spring sun. Dozens of veterans, councilmen, press, and survivors gathered outside a new building, not large, but full of purpose. Above the entry arch, the Samuel Lewis Center for Veteran Healing. Inside, PTSD therapy rooms, job retraining, a memorial garden with names never mentioned in textbooks, funded by the Jonathan Carter Legacy Foundation, approved by General Price. The ribbon was cut. A crowd applauded. But Samuel Lewis wasn't at the podium. He stood off to the side, in a dark coat, holding a single white lily. Faded, curled, but cherished. The crowd clapped for the center. But those who truly knew turned quietly toward the man who never asked to be honored. The speeches were done, the ribbon cut, reporters huddled for quotes, veterans mingled by the fountain in the garden courtyard. But Samuel Lewis remained at the edge of it all, as if he didn't belong, even though the building literally bore his name. He held the wilted lily in both hands, watching the young men and women, some limping, some stoic, step into the Samuel Lewis Center for Veteran Healing. They didn't salute him. They didn't stop to ask who he was. They just walked past quietly. And that was enough for him. He didn't need the podium. He didn't need a camera in his face. He had built his life in the shadows of duty, not in the spotlight of ceremony. But someone noticed. General Price, still dressed sharp in uniform, approached slowly. His shoulders carried the weight of years, and the burden of gratitude that never dulled. He stood beside Samuel in silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel muttered, "I told you I didn't want a building." Price gave a faint smile. "It's not a building." Samuel glanced at him sideways. "Then what is it?" "It's a thank you," Price said, "etched in stone, for every man who gave more than he got." Samuel looked at the lily again. Etched a young soldier, prosthetic arm, blank expression, stepped through the glass doors of the center. "You think they'll come?" Samuel asked, his voice low. Price followed his gaze. "They already have." For a moment, it felt like time itself paused. There were no cameras clicking, no applause, just the quiet murmurs of healing, the soft shuffle of boots on pavement, the rustle of garden trees planted in someone else's memory. Then Samuel turned to leave. His steps were slow but steady. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just walked away with the quiet dignity of a man who had carried everything and asked for nothing. But something had changed. Not in him, but in the world around him. People didn't look at him with pity anymore. They watched with respect. Because now, they knew. But as Samuel reached the edge of the field, one small voice stopped him. A child's. "Excuse me, are you the man from the story?" Samuel Lewis turned. Standing a few feet away was a young boy, maybe 10 years old. His suit was slightly oversized, his shoes scuffed from running in grass. In one hand, he held a small American flag on a stick. In the other, a program from the ceremony. "Are you the man from the story?" the boy repeated, softer this time. Samuel blinked, unsure how to answer. The boy's mother stepped forward, gently touching her son's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "Don't bother the gentleman." But Samuel shook his head slowly. "It's all right." He knelt, knees cracking faintly. Eye to eye now. "What story?" he asked. The boy held up the program, pointing to a printed paragraph tucked in the bottom corner. "It says someone carried the general's ashes. Someone from way before." Samuel smiled faintly. "That's not much of a story." "It is to me," the boy said. "My granddad's in there too." Samuel's eyes flicked to the marble markers stretching across the cemetery hill. "What was his name?" "Private Elijah Young," the boy said proudly. "He was in the Navy." Samuel nodded. "Then he served with honor." The boy hesitated, then held out his tiny flag. "Will you take this? For your friend?" Samuel paused, then reached out and accepted the small flag with both hands. "Thank you," he whispered. The mother watched in silence. Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. General Price, still standing nearby, had seen it all. As Samuel stood, his joints stiff again, the boy saluted. It was sloppy, but it was sincere. And in that simple gesture, something changed. Because history is not always passed down through medals or speeches. Sometimes it's handed off in a folded flag, or a child's curiosity, or a man like Samuel Lewis, who carried burdens for decades without ever asking to be seen. Now the boy would remember. Now others would too. The sun was lower now. Shadows stretched across the garden. Samuel turned again, this time with something different in his step. Not pride, not sorrow, just quiet acceptance. But before he could reach the gate, General Price called his name. "Wait," he said. "There's one more thing." Samuel Lewis turned once more. General Price stood still beneath the new archway of the Veteran Healing Center, something folded tightly in his hand, an official-looking document sealed in gold-trimmed parchment. He stepped forward. "It's official now," Price said quietly. Samuel raised a brow. "What is?" "You've been reinstated," he answered. "By special order." He handed Samuel the document, a formal recognition of service with the presidential seal at the bottom. "Why now?" Samuel asked. Price's voice didn't flinch. "Because it was always overdue. And because the world is finally ready to remember men like you." Samuel looked at the seal, then folded it in half without ceremony, sliding it into his coat pocket beside General Carter's letter. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Price said. They stood together for a moment longer, watching as the last guests trickled away. Veterans in wheelchairs, widows clutching folded flags, children running between the memorial garden stones. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the names carved in granite. Some names were familiar, some weren't, but all of them meant something to someone. Price turned to Samuel once more. "I don't think you realize what that walk meant to people." Samuel shook his head. "It wasn't for people." "Then who?" Price asked. Samuel looked back toward the hill, where General Carter had been laid to rest beside a stone marked "Brother, Commander, Friend." He didn't speak for a while. Then finally he whispered, "It was for him." General Price nodded once. No more words needed. Samuel stepped toward the path, toward the cemetery gate once more. The last sunbeams traced the outline of his figure. Not a shadow, but a symbol. A man who had carried a nation's memory, not on paper or screen, but in silence, step after step, year after year. And now, for the first time in decades, he walked lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because it was finally shared. As he disappeared behind the trees lining the exit, a breeze picked up, soft, steady, stirring the flags lining the path. The lilies at the base of Carter's stone fluttered slightly. No trumpet, no anthem. Just silence. The kind of silence that means everything has finally been said.